us to hear them and learn them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Tickling my throat, so I'll give my best shot here, folks. Matthew 14, 13 through 21. And when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. When the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." He said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed them, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. The disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of broken pieces, 12 baskets full. Those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. I got mixed feelings on this sermon. I keep getting the idea that I want to shoot myself in the foot every time I turn around. Maybe doing that again, I don't know. I would appreciate it if you have any input from me after the sermon. I would really appreciate it, because I'm learning as we go along anyway. And we certainly don't have to agree. As you all know, Shauna and I are really good friends. Shauna Banal, really good friends. She and I are so far apart, you can't imagine. So, and we can still be friends. So that's just. But if you would, I would really appreciate that. A 13-year-old boy once read about Albert Schweitzer's work in Africa, and he wanted to help. The only thing he had was enough money to buy 1 bottle of aspirin. So he wrote the Air Force and asked them if they could fly over Dr. Schweitzer's hospital and drop the bottle down to him. Radio station broadcast a story about this young fellow's concern for helping others, and other people began to respond. Eventually, he was flown by the government to Schweitzer's hospital along with 4.5 tons of medical supplies worth $400,000 given by thousands of people. When Dr. Schweitzer heard the story, he said, "I never thought that one child could do so much." Now, we're not told how old the young fellow was who offered the 5 loaves and 2 fish. Neither Matthew nor Luke even mention him. They simply record that in answer to Jesus' request for the disciples, came up with 5 loaves and a couple of fish with which to feed the huge crowd. There's a time-honored story about a young minister preaching his first sermon in a tiny country church. And I understand this, he was really nervous. His nervousness showed as he tried to preach on this particular text. The master fed the multitude, he said in his voice quivering, with 5,000 loaves and 2,000 fish. The old fellow sitting in the front row chuckled sarcastically and said, "Well, I can do that." The next Sunday, the young pastor tried again. "Last Sunday, I meant to say that the master fed the 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 tiny fish." Then he turned to the old man and asked, "Could you do that?" The old man grinned and said, "I could if you let me use what we had left over last week." The size of the crowd doesn't really matter. The point of the story is Jesus' compassion and his ability to feed the hungry. Even though the boy who offered the 5 loaves and 2 fish is not mentioned in our text for the day, I'm glad that the Gospel of John brings him to our attention. We have young people in this church. They're important to the work of Christ. Every once in a while, when something really important needs to be done, a young person will step forward and make a difference. And I hope our young people understand that. We do everything we can to make them understand that. Because we share a deep concern, folks. Now here's where it gets tricky. There are millions of people who do go to bed hungry every night. Now you and I have heard that too so often we get to where we're jaded. You don't take it seriously. We see it so many times on television, we see the pictures of these kids starving to death with the big bellies and all this stuff. And we just reach a point where we just shut it all out. I hope you won't do that to me today. Now, I don't know about you, I need examples to help me understand. I'm kind of a dense, I guess that's what you want to say. But examples help me. I can visualize it and understand it more clearly if I have an example. So I have a couple of examples. Someone has noted that the average person blinks his eyes 13 times every minute. I thought about counting that, but I never could figure it out. This person also noted that 13 people starve to death every minute of the world. That means that every time you and I blink our eyes, another person has died of starvation. In an article about sometime back by the Christian Century, Tom Peterson described the tragedy of world hunger like this. He said, imagine a DC-10 preparing to land and is filled with preschool-aged children. Some of the children sleep, others play and laugh, still others cry for the flight attendant's attention. Just before landing, however, something goes wrong, and the plane plummets to the ground, killing all on board. 10 minutes later, even before the emergency vehicles arrive, another plane load of children crashes right next to the first. Then 10 minutes later, a third crashes. And the tragedy continued. Every 10 minutes, a jet falls to the earth all day, all night, day after day, month after month. That's the same number of children, 40,000, who die each day from hunger-related diseases. Can you imagine? 40,000 every day. The mind can hardly grasp the scope of such a catastrophe. Millions of people go to bed and are hungry every night. And this hunger persists in spite of the fact that we live in a bountiful world. Did you know that in one day, Americans eat 228,000 bushels of onions? Oh, man, I don't like onions. But every day of every year, over 250,000 bushels of onions. Now, that's not to mention a lot of other stuff. Peas and green beans and field corn and soybeans. The earth just keeps producing more and more and more. We see that in our lifetime, especially on the farm. I remember too long ago, if you got 100 bushels of corn, you would really done something special. Now that's a joke. Ann Dillard describes what she calls God's extravagance by using the example of a rye plant. You all know what a rye plant is. They're using that rye today as a cover crop. In fact, my neighbor down there he put that in his beans, in his rye, and that's where cover crop. You know what a rye plant is, okay? In 4 months, a single rye plant can grow 378 miles of roots and 14 billion root hairs. In 1 cubic inch of soil, the length of these root hairs would total 6,000 miles. 1 inch. This is an abundant world. I also wonder who in the world figured that out, you know. The battle to feed the world's people is not a hopeless one, however. God has given us the resources, and in some places in the world, real progress is being made. For example, when we think of hunger, at least I do, many of us still think of the nation of India. In 1986, India grew so much grain that it didn't have enough room in the storage facilities to hold it all. 17 years ago, a famous rock concert was staged to raise money for the malnourished in Bangladesh. Remember Bangladesh? These days, Bangladesh is self-sufficient. We're making progress. In our own country, of course, farmers are still producing far more food than we can possibly use, which in itself causes problems. Lee Iacocca tells us about a California dairy farmer who was so productive that the government paid him $8 million to slaughter his herd. That's done around here. Up north, you might go very far up north, you see dairies that are just closed up. The government bought them out. Problem? Too much milk. In the 1950s and 60s, scientists were predicting world famine by 1985, but they were wrong. There's plenty of food to feed the world's people. We don't really have a food problem, we have a distribution problem. What we have are people problems. Some of these problems we can't do anything about. For example, we can't do anything about the political problems of governments that use food as a weapon to control our people. We can't control the extreme climates in parts of the world. I understand that. But there are some things we can do. We can rethink our own stewardship of Earth's resources. That gets tricky again. Did you know, for example, that 6 billion Europeans eat as much food as 240 million Africans? 6 million. 240 million. Even more startling, the citizens of this country, we form 5.7% of the world population, we eat half the food produced in the whole world. Somebody's eating more than their share. I know I'm one of them. We spend 10 times, this is where it really hurts here, I'll tell you the truth. We spend 10 times more money on the feeding of cats and dogs than the country of Guinea earns as its national income. Just for the local cats. We are an indulgent, wasteful people. Each of us needs to examine our stewardship of the bounty with which God has blessed us. We really do. I know that's not easy. We also need to recognize that as Christians we are accountable for the needs of our neighbors, whether it's in the next door or around the world. We are the responsibility, you see, you and I, because we're Christians. There's a wonderful old story about a missionary team in Africa. They were loading their boat to go down the Congo River. As they were preparing to start out, a native chieftain called to them across the river. He said, "White man, I want you to come and tell my people about your God." The leader of the mission group answered, "We can't come today, but we have an appointment downstream. We'll come another day." The chief persisted, "No, you must come today and tell my people about your great God." Again, the leader tried to explain they couldn't come today, they'd be glad to come another day. This didn't satisfy the chief, however. As the mission team pushed off to leave, the chief waded out into the river calling after the missionaries. "White man, if you don't come tell my people about your God, I'm going to tell your God on you." I just hope nobody ever tells God that we heard about 40,000 children dying each day from hunger-related diseases and did nothing to help. Hope somebody don't tell God about that. You say, "Well, where can we make a difference? Where we get?" I don't know. I only know that World Service is one of the best in the world. I think 97%, I think it's 92% of the money that you give goes where it's supposed to go. A lot of these organizations, if they get 50%, well, at least 50% goes for administration and for advertising. So you got to be careful. But there are places. In 1930, during the Great Depression, a man called Golden Rule Jones was mayor of Toledo, Ohio. During his term of office, he sometimes sat as presiding judge in night court. One night, a man was brought in for stealing money from a grocery store. His defense was that he needed the money for food and he was simply a victim of hard times. Nevertheless, Golden Rule Jones found him guilty. He said, "You didn't steal from society, you stole from a private citizen, and you broke the law, and I'm fining you $10. However, he reached for his wallet. "I'll pay it for you." Next, he instructed the bailiff to pass the hat around the courtroom, and he said, "I'm fining everybody here at least 50 cents. You're all guilty of being members of a society that made it necessary for this man to steal. Collection will go to the defendant." Now, I know that example has its problems. I certainly understand that. Because I believe, you see, that salvation is by grace and grace alone. But I wonder if one day the divine judge will hold those of us who have so much accountable for those who have so little. The teaching of Jesus on such things ought to make us tremble, for we are accountable, you and I. Of course, there are hungers besides those of bread. Many of you are already involved in meeting those needs. I don't know all what you do, but I do know some. Helping at food distribution areas, volunteers at hospitals, collecting for food pantries, helping here at the church, mentoring school children, pen pals, the list goes on. I understand what you're doing. And I applaud it. Of course, the greatest hunger of people have is for the bread of life, which is Christ Jesus. The Christian missionary enterprise will not be completed, folks, until every child in this world has a full stomach, a comfortable home in which to live, and knows deep in their hearts that they are, in fact, a child of God and worship. Now, that's an ambitious dream, I know. But I believe that's a dream worthy of the followers of Jesus Christ. You and I. Final story. A relief official had just returned from the famine areas of Africa. He wrote a letter to the New York City newspaper telling of the young people he met there, the young volunteers. He had found there who were giving their time and energy, who were making sacrifices to help the impoverished and suffering Africans. The young people were living in dangerous and difficult conditions, and the official was very much impressed with it. So he wrote a letter to the newspaper, is what he said. As we passed the day together, I took a moment to ask each of them why. Why had they volunteered? Charles Petrie, who had just finished a Master of Business Administration program in France and planned to become an international consultant, said he was there to make a contribution. Anne Levine, with a master's degree in economics, said there was a need. Mary Crickmore said it was her Christian commitment. Duty. Tell me what it is that we are doing because of our Christian commitment. That's something each one of us have to struggle with in our own lives. Each of us can do something, however. It has anything to do with your age or anything else. Each of us can do something. I challenge you to find out what that is for you. Each of us has some kind of fish and loaves to offer to the Master. We have to determine what's ours. And then do it. Let's pray together. Father, this is hard for us to hear.